Now, I think it's very important that we first address the most important, most pressing, and urgent issue threatening Western comics right now, and that is the complete and utter lack of asses on all of these male superheroes. I mean, come on! If you're going to be a male superhero, you need to have a super ass. It is just common sense, people. Give them some nice big booties to fill out those spandex speedos, and also give them back those spandex speedos too. See? This is what happens when you let straight men into the comics industry. All of these white, cisgendered, straight, male diversity hires coming in, taking all of the speedos out of our comics and robbing us of the male ass that real comics readers demand. These straight men are ruining our comics, and we gays must rise up to take back what has always been rightfully ours. Hey everyone, my name is Jacob, but the trolls, they call me Snowflake. Oh, the hashtag Comicsgate people are going to be coming after me for this one, and quite frankly, I can't wait, because the quality of hate comments on YouTube has really gone downhill to a comical degree. Seriously, I have gotten scathing comments on Reddit, but everything here on YouTube is just so bad and impotent, it's hilarious. Now, honestly, I've never been a big comic reader, mostly because I can't be bothered to go out and buy the new comic every week, and because I can't stand the need to have to read this run and that series just to understand what the fuck is going on in a lot of mainstream comics nowadays, and I absolutely cannot stand the need to have everything be a continuity. Like, you just can't have a reinvention or someone else's different take on a bunch of characters on a story. No, it has to be a different continuity, and it's very rare for me to buy a comic, though I absolutely do adore Neil Gaiman's Sandman. It's one of my favorite pieces of media ever, and is such a huge piece of inspiration for me in my own writing. And I'm also a huge fan of The Runaways, and I'm totally hoping to get the newest run for Christmas. But while I don't really read comics because I can't be bothered, I do my best to keep up to date with the newest things and the newest storylines, because I do actually really love these characters, both from Marvel and DC. I absolutely love the DC animated movies, at least back when, they weren't just DC's attempt to ram Damian Wayne into everything and were, actually good. God, I hate you, Damian Wayne. That's a topic for another video. Seriously though, Superman vs. the Elites and Batman Under the Red Hood are amazing and probably some of my favorite animated movies ever, because they so perfectly encapsulate these stories and the aspects of these heroes that I love so much, and that I feel are so often misused by comic writers and shrugged off by quote-unquote comic fans. And I will admit that I'm a big Marvel fanboy right now. I love all the new Marvel movies. I'm so happy that Marvel is really having its time in the sun. I cannot wait to see what Marvel is now able to do now that they have their entire catalog back under their control again, even though, yes, I know that the Fox-Disney merger is a horrific, monopolistic nightmare, but still, X-Men in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, I can't wait! And honestly, I'm nowhere near tired of them at all. Like, I don't even understand how you can get tired of superhero movies. Like, how? Aren't superhero stories supposed to be, like, the thing that no one ever gets tired of? I mean, as long as they're good, right? And maybe that's kind of where the problem lies. So, no one needs me to tell them how bad the current DC movies are overall. And honestly, you could probably go into a several hour long episode on just why it is that DC movies have been tanking and turning out to be so terrible. The DC's inability to understand that grim dark does not equal deep and impactful. The fact that DC is just so obsessed with letting Zack Snyder dip his dick into everything. God, Zack Snyder is such a terrible filmmaker. Ugh. If you want more along that line, I highly recommend the video on the subject by fellow YouTuber Michael Saba, as well as the review of Man of Steel by Dan Olsen of the channel Folding Ideas. But I think that it still speaks to the same central problem that exists at the center of so much of the straight, white, cisgendered male love of comics and video games, because even though I say it partially in jest, it is kind of true that straight, white, cisgendered men have kind of ruined comics the same way that they ruined video games for a time, because of this escapist, misogynistic fantasy that were cultivated amongst these fan bases who loathe any deeper meaning and deeper message and demand that these things they love provide them with the fantasy of power and superiority, this fantasy of not questioning the system that they claim has treated them so badly, but rather a fantasy of being on top of that oppressive system rather than challenging it. And while these people are not necessarily the majority of the fan base, people of color, women, gay people have always been present within the comic community and within the industry, many of them even forming the foundation of modern comics. Jewish people being a great example of that, them being some of the architects of the media itself. But these predominantly straight, predominantly white, predominantly cisgendered men are some some of the most vocal members of the community in ways that only those who are having their impotent self-masturbatory power fantasies challenged can be. And both Marvel and DC are guilty of trying to satisfy this group of comics fans, even though you do not want these people being fans of your work, because these are the people who make fandoms so intolerable and so inhospitable for everyone who is not them. These people who literally ruin fandoms. But I feel like the DC movies and comics currently are kind of the most visible symptom of this problem in comics. And like, especially on the left, there's this sense that superheroes are this relic of an older, more conservative time, and that superheroes have this inherent fascist undertone, where I'm like, no, a lot of these heroes still have a lot of relevance in our modern age, and that they still have a message which we still need in this day and age, maybe now more than ever. And maybe the fact that toxic fanbros and fascists are so dead set on taking these heroes for themselves is a sign that we need to try and take them back. Now, as fellow Canadian YouTuber Thought Slime says in his video on Batman, can we maybe not give Batman to the fascists? Like, can we not let them have that? And yeah, I second that. Can we not give the fascists our favorite superheroes? Because like everything else that straight, white, cisgendered men touch, they will just ruin it. And I highly recommend that video as well if you want more on this topic. So, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give comics readers and leftist comic fans a roadmap that, if followed, will make sure that the fascists and hashtag comic gators will never even want to look at another comic book ever again. I'm going to go through some of my favorite DC superheroes, talk about the essential themes that I see in them, and what they still have to teach us in our modern day. I'm also focusing on DC heroes because I feel like DC has a much stronger focus on canon than Marvel does. Marvel heroes, I find, are much more mutable and much more open to interpretation overall, and much more open to reinvention, whereas I feel like DC heroes are much more fixed and much more sort of idols or icons, and so they have themes which run through their many adventures. And there's also the fact that out of both Marvel and DC, I think most people would say that DC is the one which has repeatedly doubled down on the Comicsgate people and kept going with the toxic things that have been slowly destroying comics, while Marvel has at least tried at certain points to inject new life into the art form. And seriously, DC, you can contact me on Twitter if you want to hire me. I have so many ideas for your entire canon. I will make you relevant again. Pluck me from obscurity, please. I guess let's start with probably the most famous superhero of them all, and massive allegory for Jewishness, Superman. We apparently live in an age where Superman seems for many people to be irrelevant, where he seems to be of a more idealistic, more innocent age, that he just falls apart in the face of the cynicism, the amorality, and the greediness of the current day, and that all of this makes him someone who people just can't relate to, not to mention the fact that he just seems so powerful and invulnerable that there's no stakes to his story. But honestly, I think every single bit of that is complete and utter bullshit. I mean, first and foremost, you can have a super OP main character and still have stakes to their story. You know, what happens if they're tricked into doing something that gets a lot of innocent people killed, or causes some kind of other horrible disaster? What happens if their family members are threatened or hurt? What happens if they lose everything? What happens if they go through a huge emotional crisis? What happens if their secret identity is exposed and that leads to any of the previous scenarios? What happens if they're captured and imprisoned? And besides, there's loads of things that can still at least hurt Superman. It seems like basically everyone and their mother has at least a sliver of kryptonite kicking around nowadays. I immediately think of Neil Gaiman's Sandman, where half the main characters in each story are omnipresent abstract thoughts and concepts, so vast and so infinite that human minds can only perceive but one singular aspect of their infinite faces and forms, whose actions can completely change reality itself, and who, if you do actually manage to kill one of them, will simply be replaced with another aspect and interpretation of themselves. Sandman is a story of absolutely massively OP characters, but it's still amazing because it still handles that very well, and there are most definitely still very real stakes for all of the characters involved, because not every story should have to have immediate threat to life and limb just for people to be interested. And if that is what it takes for you to be invested in a story, then I think that that says more about you than about the story. Also, why the hell am I bringing up Sandman? Anyone who thinks that Superman is unrelatable and not realistic enough has probably never even heard of Sandman, because they are not, of course, a true connoisseur of the comic art form form as I am. And let's also not forget that Superman's OP nature can also be a huge disadvantage in his normal everyday life too. Imagine being a man who can lift a tanker ship on his own, trying to turn a doorknob, or trying to hug someone he loves. Imagine being a man who could punch someone into low Earth orbit, having to sit there and listen to some jerk yell at him. Imagine being a man who can fly faster than the speed of sound, having to slow down enough so that he doesn't shatter skyscrapers and send them tumbling down onto pedestrians below. Imagine the restraint that Clark Kent must live with every single day of his life just to be able to keep his identity secret, so that his friends and family aren't targeted by the next genocidal maniac with delusions of grandeur. That, I think, is something which does make Superman relatable, because even though none of us have to worry about others to such a degree, we all still have to restrain ourselves just to exist in this world together, some of us being better at that than others. And there's loads more about Superman that's relatable too, because for all the operatic tragedy of being the last survivor of a bright and shining world that self-destructs from within, Clark Kent is really a child sent away from his parents, from a place where they knew he would never survive, in the hopes that he would be able to have a better life somewhere else, somewhere they hope he would be safe, and where they hoped he would be able to make something of himself. Clark is, in essence, a refugee growing up in small-town America. Clark's story is one of being inherently different from everyone around you by simple virtue of coming from somewhere else and being adopted, something which he slowly begins to realize more and more as he matures, and these differences between him and everyone else come to the surface. And Clark does make something of himself. He reaches a level of success, fame, and impact that he never could have reached back where he was born, even if it didn't blow up, and in fact achieves so much power that he is eventually able to go back to what remains of his homeland and help those who manage to also escape in Kandor. Superman's story is that of the immigrant, of those who fled to America and achieved greatness, and I would love to see that be explored in more detail in his comics. Really hammer home the refugee metaphor. Hell, if I was in charge, I would maybe consider making Clark's skin tone a little bit darker. Not super dark or anything, just a few shades darker than Ma and Pa Kent and the rest of Smallville, just to really keep up the metaphor. But that still leaves the question of what Superman represents. What themes does he embody? And people have bandied about a lot of different things, from Christ allegories to fascist colonialism and American overreach. But I see it as something rather more simplistic and essential than that. You see, there's a lot of talk right now about the idea of privilege. And the basic idea of privilege is, well, luck. Have you been lucky enough to have been born within circumstances that make it so that you don't have to face certain problems in your life? Not that you don't have any problems, but that there are certain problems that you don't have to face. Were you born within a dominant racial group so that you don't have to deal with racism? Were you born into a well-off family or an impoverished one? Were you born able-bodied, or were you born with a disability? Or did you become disabled later on? Did your parents love you and treat you well growing up? All of these things have a real effect on your life and the sorts of experiences you have, the sorts of opportunities you receive, and the obstacles you face. And Clark is incredibly lucky and privileged. Not only did the pod that his birth parents placed him in make it to Earth unharmed after drifting for who knows how long, but he happened to land in the field of the Kents, two people who took him in, gave him a warm, loving, and accepting home, and who raised him as their own. Clark not only had one set, but two sets of parents who loved him unconditionally and with all their hearts. He had a good upbringing where he obviously didn't want for anything. I mean, yeah, the Kents aren't exactly well off or anything, but they definitely are above the poverty line. And they're sober, and they're good parents to him. He wasn't injured when the pod crash landed on Earth and came away from it completely unscathed and completely healthy. And in recent years, the fact that he even has powers in the first place is down to the fact that Earth has a yellow sun and not a red one, like Krypton. Clark has been immensely lucky in his life. I don't think that it's too much of an exaggeration to say that Clark is Superman today because of all of the privilege and the luck he has had throughout his life, because at any point over the course of his life, it could have been sidetracked and derailed, and he never would have been able to be where he is today. There's a DC movie called Justice League Gods and Monsters, where Superman wasn't found by the Kents, but was found by a pair of Mexican migrants crossing the US border, and was raised as a quote-unquote illegal alien. I mean, Clark is always an illegal alien, but in this story, he lived a much less privileged life, and his life does take a very, very different turn, and he becomes a very, very different person. A much less happy one, I think I could say. Clark has been so fortunate in his life to have had so many advantages and so many strokes of good fortune, and really, I think he knows that. I think he knows that his life could have gone very, very differently if only one single thing had gone wrong, that it could have easily been anyone who had gotten the stroke of good luck that he had, and that the only reason why it was him was, well, luck. And Clark didn't decide any of this. This was either decided for him by his parent or by chance. But what Clark does have the ability to decide is what he does with this privilege. One of the tenets of left-wing ideology is the idea that if you have privilege, then you have the ability to use it to help those who don't have it. This is what we call being an ally. You're not a member of that community, but you're someone who has a privilege that that community doesn't, and you've decided to take your privilege and throw it behind the cause of that community. This is what makes Clark a true hero. Not the powers, not the bloodline he has, not the history, but his decision to say, I have been so fortunate in my life. I have had such a streak of good luck to get me here, and so many people have supported me to get here that I need to use all of the gifts I have been given towards helping other people, because so many people in this world are not as fortunate as I am. Clark has enough power to conquer the world, but instead he decided to help people, to try and make the world a better place so that everyone can be as fortunate as him. And I think that that's a desire that really speaks to left-wing people and leftists like myself. As a progressive person, the thing that really drives you is this dream of a better world, a world where there is no poverty, where there is no racism, where there is no bigotry and prejudice and hate crimes and xenophobia, where there is a place for everyone in the world and where everyone is equal and everyone is happy, where we may all bask in luxury, non-binary, fully automated, gay space communism. But along with this dream, you also have to acknowledge that the world is a long way away from any of that, and how good your life is so often depends on where you were born, who you were born as, and all of those things that you have no control over, and that there are a whole lot of people who are perfectly happy for things to stay the way they are. And honestly, it does get really overwhelming sometimes, especially lately. You just think, is it ever possible? Is it ever actually going to get better? Or is it all hopeless? Has mankind just jumped the shark? Is life in our universe just destined to self-destruct in an explosion of hatred, bigotry, and fascism? And yeah, sometimes you do think that's hopeless and that all the struggle will be in vain. But at least for me anyway, this is often just a passing indulgence. I'm the sort of person who doesn't give up easily, sometimes to a fault, and I always end up thinking, well, so what? So what if it's all hopeless? That's not an excuse, because there are still people who are suffering right now that we can help. Because yeah, we may never get to a better world, but we're definitely never going to get there if we don't try. And that, for me, is what Superman represents. Superman is the person who strives to make the world a better place for everyone, who tries the best he can to fight the problems that still hold us all back, who fights for those who have not been as lucky as him. And yeah, that ideal world in our most far-flung dreams may never come to pass, but that only means that we need to keep it in our minds as we work to build it. And trust me, I will be the first to say that if the only thing you have to tell people like me who struggle under stigma and oppression every single day of our lives is, well, eventually when the revolution comes, it will be better, as some leftists tend to do, then maybe you need to find some more immediate priorities. But that doesn't mean that dreaming still isn't important. We need to fight both the short-term war and the long-term war, and we can never lose sight of that goal at the end. We need the dreamers, maybe now more than ever, and for me, that's what Superman symbolizes. The dream of a perfect world and the desire to try and get there, even if it's hard, and even if it takes a long, long time, because how else are we ever going to get there? And the fact that so many people think that Superman is so unrealistic in our modern times, I think shows that we need him now more than ever. Now, I also think that it helps to contrast the themes a hero represents with that hero's particular evil nemesis, because a good nemesis, I feel, is really supposed to represent the hero's opposite, the opposing ideology to theirs, because it's through their interaction that we see these two competing sides conflict and crash against each other, just like they do in real life. For Superman, his obvious nemesis is, of course, Lex Luthor, who on the surface is kind of the brain to Superman's brawn, though Clark is plenty smart on his own, but just as Clark is someone who has been immensely fortunate and lucky in his life, so has Lex. While he started off being written as a self-made man in earlier incarnations, current origins of Lex Luthor depict him as a son of wealthy business magnates, born into a life of absurd wealth and, again, privilege. Privilege different and to a much greater extent than Clark's, but certainly privilege nonetheless. But whereas Superman looks at his privilege and says, I have this because of luck, so I need to use this to help others, because really, how else am I going to justify why I got it and not anyone else? Lex looks at the privilege he has had in his life, at the life of luxury he has lived, and says, I have this because I deserve it. I got this because I am better than everyone else, because I'm smarter, because I'm richer, because I am just inherently superior to everyone else. If anyone has a problem with that, well, they shouldn't have been born poor, they shouldn't have been born stupid. I think that Lex really has the potential to mirror a lot of the villains in our modern times, the Trumps of the world who believe that they're better than everyone else because they were able to get $1 million loan from their parents when they were starting out, the Silicon Valley quote-unquote disruptors, and the Elon Musks of the world who claim that they're going to save the world with their inventions but really only care about about making as much money as possible and only actively make things worse for those who have to work for them, and to show how this kind of wealth and immense privilege can warp a person's perception of the world. Studies do show that wealth actually does inhibit a person's ability to feel empathy for others, after all. Unlike Superman, who believes that for all his power and strength, he is no better than anyone else. He's just using the gifts that he's been given. Lex believes that he is owed power, believes that he deserves to be on top of the world, and so when he sees, this, corn-fed pig fucker from literal Smallsville, USA, and an illegal alien to boot, getting so much acclaim and so much love from the people, he absolutely can't stand it, because he can't stand that there is someone in this world who is better than him, let alone someone who he feels isn't as smart or deserving as him. And everything he does is an effort to prove just how superior he is to Superman. That, and Superman probably tries to stop him from selling arms to Saudi Arabia, or liberates one of his sweatshops or something too. Looking at him like this, and living in the times we live, it's absolutely no surprise to me that Lex Luthor's persona as a business mogul was styled on Donald Trump, though I wouldn't advise giving Lex Luthor a yellow toupee or anything. That'd be a bit too on the nose even for me. There's this moment in the animated movie All-Star Superman, which personally I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of just because it's not my style, but there's this one moment that I really feel makes the movie and really perfectly encapsulates Luthor in a nutshell. You see, Luthor steals this serum from the Fortress of Solitude that can give humans the powers of Kryptonians temporarily, and of course what does he do but try to kill Superman with it. Superman manages to make it wear off faster and then blast the last vial of it with his heat vision right in front of Lex's eyes. And Lex, seeing this, says, oh, I could have saved the world, I could have changed everything, I could have done all of these things with all of this power if you just had let me have it, if you just hadn't been in my way all this time. And Superman looks him dead in the eye and says, you always could have done that, Lex. You always could have saved the world. With all of the intelligence and all of the money you have, you always had the ability to save the world all along, but you repeatedly and endlessly chose not to. And why didn't he do that? Because he thought he was better than everyone else. Superman fights for a world where everyone is equal, where everyone can have the privilege and the fortune that he has had in his life, a world which doesn't need him anymore. Lex fights only for his own sake, for his own ego, to protect his own status at the top of the pyramid, because how dare any of those below him want to take away his own superiority from him. Lex fights for the world to stay the way it is now because that's a world which benefits him. Lex fights for a world that relies on him, that cannot survive without people like him. Now, just because Lex Luthor is a rich prick, that doesn't mean that every rich character in DC needs to be a prick, and this is the best transition I can think of to move on to probably one of my favorite characters ever created, Batman. Now calm down, fellow socialists, I know Bruce Wayne is rich, but that's not really his fault, and personally I don't hold it against him, because in a way, he's similar to Superman in that way of acknowledging how lucky he is being born wealthy, and decides to use it to make other people's lives better. I think that that's really kind of the foundation of most superheroes, really. And it's really Bruce who turns Wayne Enterprises into the philanthropic organization that it currently is in the comics, where, all of its attention is focused squarely on using science and technology to improve the world and, give Batman some tools, but on the side. Honestly, I really think that Bruce Wayne kind of loathes his money, kind of sees it as blood money. The Waynes, of course, are one of the founding families of Gotham, and historically, they've probably been just as corrupt and just as exploitative as all the other head families of Gotham. And it's really only his parents who decided to stop making a profit off of Gotham's corruption and try to use it to make Gotham better. And I think in a far more personal way, I think he sees it really as something that didn't stop his parents from dying. So I personally think that he actually plans on running through as much of the money as possible before he dies. Maybe leave enough for Dick, Jason, Tim, and the rest of the Bat family to continue their own work, but I really think that he wants to take the Wayne fortune with him as maybe a way to erase the blood from his family's hands. And I think what really defines Bruce is, of course, this singular event in his life, the loss of his parents, which, has been portrayed to death at this point. But what makes him a hero is what he does with that trauma. Bruce could have easily just tracked down Joe Chill, killed him, and been done with it. No one ever would have blamed him for that, and he could have just retired to a life of boring, idle luxury. And I know that some people have tried to turn Joe Chill into the Joker, but I honestly think that that's just a really terrible idea, and part of this whole bullshit are connected in such an intrinsic personal way, which I think is just lazy, terrible writing. But personally, I kind of like the idea that Joe Chill is just this screw-up, this pathetic man who either robbed the Waynes just for the pearl house so he could buy another bottle of booze, or maybe have him be indebted to the Gotham mob who wanted to make an example out of the Waynes or something. And I think that Bruce started out just wanting revenge, just wanting to track down the man who killed his parents and bring him to justice. But at some point, he realized that what happened to him also has happened to other kids like him, and that it was because of Gotham's corruption, not necessarily its crime, but the corruption that allows that crime to flourish, which killed his parents, because they dared stand up to it. Because, as they say, evil can only flourish when good men do nothing. Corruption can only take root when people look the other way and don't take it seriously, and then it reinforces its own power through fear and intimidation. But if you're not afraid of it, then it holds no power over you. Bruce may have started his crusade against crime out of anger for the loss of his parents, but while I think he always has that anger and that rage and that sadness inside of him, what keeps him going is the knowledge that this tragedy is continuing, and that it will keep continuing as long as the corruption in Gotham is allowed to continue. And that corruption goes all the way to the very top of Gotham, that the founding families of Gotham have profited off of it for decades, that his family fortune comes from it, that the mayor and the city of Gotham is in the pocket and supporting the organized crime of the city and vice versa, that the police are corrupt and not doing their job properly, and that all of the small criminals that Batman has traditionally been depicted fighting are there as a result of that corruption and because of the inequality that that corruption has spawned. In Thought Slime's video, he talks about how he doesn't like how Batman works with the cops, and I totally understand that, even though I've said before, I'm not one of those leftists who want to abolish policing altogether. I think it should be reformed, absolutely, but I don't think it should be abolished. Really though, I think that Batman really doesn't work with the cops. I think he works with Jim Gordon because he trusts Jim Gordon, and because he knows that he and Jim Gordon have the same goals in cleaning up Gotham City. But I don't think that he works with the cops as a whole, especially early on in his tenure as Batman, because the cops back then were probably just as corrupt as the rest of the city, if not more so. And I think that Batman keeps just as big an eye on the cops as he does the criminals, and that he is just as ready to beat up cops who misuse their power as he does to beat up another mob enforcer. Personally, I would love to see like a small little issue or like an introduction to an arc where Batman stops a cop from killing an unarmed black man and just beats the living tar out of this guy. Like, just breaks every bone in his fucking body and strings him up in front of the police headquarters as a way of saying, this is not happening in my city. You understand me? For me, if I could sum up Batman's ideology in one word, it would be integrity. Batman is trying to teach Gotham City integrity once again because, as I said, corruption can only flourish when people let it happen, when people look the other way, and corruption keeps itself intact and in power by convincing people to continue looking the other way, either through rhetoric, telling them that it's not important, telling them that, oh, this is just the way things go, or through fear, and that fear can be fear of the other, the illegal aliens are coming and they'll be taking your jobs, or the fear of the consequences of challenging the status quo. However, once people stop being afraid and refuse to be afraid, then corruption has very little else it can do. And that's what Batman is trying to seed within Gotham City. He is trying to tell the citizens of Gotham, and hell, probably the world at a certain point, that you don't have to be afraid anymore, that you have the power to clean up your cities and your homes and your neighborhoods, that all you have to do is not be afraid and hold those who corrupt your cities and countries to account. And he works to show those who try to keep the status quo intact and profit from it that they're the ones who should be afraid because their hold on power is so weak and fragile, and because Batman isn't going to let them get away with anything anymore, that Batman is always watching and Batman will come for them when they think no one else can. Honestly, it's surprising to me that so many people think Batman is kind of fascist, because the way I see it, Batman is kind of Antifa, don't you? Really, the only thing you need to do to make sure that he doesn't become fascist is to make sure he beats up white guys in suits and cops just as much, if not more, as he beats up drug dealers. And then, of course, who better to be the nemesis of kind of Antifa than the ultimate troll in Western literature, Joker? Because really, when you really think about it, Joker is just another one of those white, straight, cisgendered male comedians whose jokes never really seem to get on because of all of the feminazi PC cucks, and, would eventually decide to go on a rampage against the world because of it. Because everything is a joke to Joker. The entire world is a joke to him because, hey, he's a white, straight, cisgendered guy. What does he have to worry about? It's not like any of this affects him. It's not like anything really matters. Okay, maybe that's not entirely accurate. I mean, he did fall into a vat of acid, but while I know that certain leftists wouldn't mind pushing some comedians into one, that, of course, I think is not necessarily entirely applicable, but I think that it's definitely a very interesting edge to put on his character. I also really wouldn't have had Batman involved in his transformation, because I think that it's more striking when the villain kind of happens on their own and then latches on to the hero rather than them having some connection, beforehand. And again, honestly, I think it's often lazy writing trying to build a conflict between them, instead of doing it organically. But I don't think that it's an exaggeration to call Joker a troll, because as I said, the entire world is a joke to him, and the best jokes are things that he doesn't need and doesn't want, like integrity, morality, and all of the things that Batman represents, because, he faces no consequence for not having those, and really only gains power within the system from casting them aside, like so many other white, straight, cisgendered men. He feels that people are just fooling themselves if they think that they're any better than he is, that they're anything other than cruel, cold, and heartless. And in a way, yeah, Joker is kind of right. We live in a system where we fight for the right to sell arms to regimes perpetrating genocide just because it means jobs for us. We buy phones that we know drove their workers to suicide from overworking. We buy clothes that were made in sweatshops with child labor that routinely collapse. We all commit atrocities every single day by just existing within the system we exist in. But he takes it and he makes it a very selfish way of looking at things, because he doesn't seek to show people what they're a part of, not to try to make them change. He does it to drag them down to his level, to prove that he's right. And honestly, I think he really actually abuses the system to get away with what he does. He exploits the passivity, the cruelty, and the faults within the systems to get away with it. Batman tells people to stand up and take notice. Joker tells people to just sit back and watch. And he does this because he is cruel and cold and heartless and looks at the world as a joke. He hurts people because it's fun and because he gets to have power over others. And he has to prove that he's justified in doing it, because in the end, I'm not entirely sure how quote-unquote mad Joker really is. I think, he's definitely warped and twisted. I think he lacks almost all human empathy, but I don't think he's insane. He's not mentally ill. I think he knows exactly what he's doing, and what he's doing is trying to prove a point. And I think he plays up being mentally ill to excuse the consequences and to go to Arkham Asylum, where it's easier to break out, pretending in a very similar way that trolls nowadays pretend to be autistic because they think that will let them say whatever the hell they want. And in the end, I think he's only as insane as Batman is, which again probably makes him all the more worthy a nemesis. Joker is a failed comedian who wants to tear down the world for not laughing along with him and recognizing for the genius that he was. And then he looks up at Batman, working to inspire people and challenge the status quo, sees the symbol of integrity, of righteousness, of morality, of engagement, of standing up and trying to change the world, all these things which Joker believes are pointless and useless and are lies that people tell themselves to make themselves feel superior to people like him. So Joker essentially sees Batman kind of as the ultimate hypocrite, just like the alt-right trolls see people like me on the left as hypocrites and transform us into these evil pawns in a global conspiracy to destroy Western civilization, to justify the harassment and the violence that they visit upon us, just because we dared to say that their entertainment may be kind of sexist and kind of racist. And Joker does horrible things to try and make Batman abandon his morality, his integrity, and his righteousness, poking and needling at every single little pressure point he can with Batman to try and find out that one that will make Batman snap, because Joker only needs one single moment to be proven right. Because ultimately, Joker wants Batman to kill him. Joker wants Batman to murder him, so Joker can use his dying breath to laugh at Batman and finally know that he was right all along, that Batman is just as vile, just as violent, and just as heartless as he is. And this, everyone, is why Batman doesn't kill Joker, because he doesn't want to give Joker what he wants. Trolls want nothing more than to prove that their assumptions about people were right, and giving them that only makes them more powerful, as hard as it is sometimes, and as good as it does kind of feel to stoop to their level sometimes. And yeah, sometimes you have to stoop to people's level, but sometimes you have to keep the higher ground. I'm sure Bruce wants to kill Joker. The most impactful scene in Batman Under the Red Hood, probably my favorite DC movie ever, is Batman saying just how much he wants to kill the Joker, but he can't, because he knows he has enough anger and hatred in him to do it, and that the anger and the hatred will swallow him up up if he did, that he doesn't trust himself enough to know that he'll be able to pull himself back if he went to that place. Like I said earlier, Bruce could have easily killed Joe Chill and be done with it. He could have easily come to hate the world and rage against it just like Joker did. But the reason he didn't was because he had good parents and good people surrounding him who loved him and who showed him how to channel that for the better. And because he had a legacy that he wanted to live up to from his parents, but still the anger and the rage is still there. Sometimes you just need to say no to yourself. Sometimes you can't give in to your anger and your hurt. That's something that I think a lot of people who are mentally ill and who have gone through what Bruce have had to live with, including myself. You can't feed the monster inside of you because that will eventually swallow you up. And come on, Joker's not worth that. And don't tell me that the day after Joker was dead, there wouldn't be a dozen shitty white edgelords running around the streets with clown masks and AKs. This is probably, I guess, a great time to go back and add Superman and all heroes into this conversation too, and ask why they don't kill on principle. There are a lot of leftists out there who regularly say things like kill all TERFs, liberals get the bullet too, and who believe that violent revolution and the killing of those in power is the only way to move forward, or at least who LARP with those ideas. But while you're not going to hear me defending the Nazis or the TERFs or anything from such tack, I will defend the stance of killing being wrong. And the best defense I think I can come up with is probably my other favorite DC movie, Superman vs. the Elite. Now basically in the movie, the elites are a group of superpowered people who believe that violence, that murder, and that cruelty is the only way to change anything. That people will only ever listen to violence and bloodshed, and they clash repeatedly with Superman over this, until they finally challenge Superman to a fight to the death. I don't want to spoil the movie or anything for anyone, so if you haven't seen it, I can't recommend it enough. Seriously, go see it, because I think the most powerful thing that the movie brings up is the inherent law in this sort of violent worldview, and that flaw is, well, who exactly are the evildoers? Because here's the rub. The ideology that violence is the only thing that solves anything is almost always made from a position of power, or a position of assumed power. In the movie, this statement is almost always only ever made by those in a Western, predominantly white country, and the quote-unquote evildoers are often those in other non-white, non-Western countries. It's only ever fun to say that violence solves everything when the only violence being perpetrated is against someone else, and it suddenly becomes seriously not fun when the violence is turned around back at you. Manchester Black, the leader of the elites, even says at one point in the movie, might makes right, but the movie then works to show that that statement is almost always said with the assumption that you are the one with the might, and that the minute someone comes around that has more might than you, suddenly that belief just melts away. Seriously, anyone who thinks that superheroes are unrealistic if they don't kill needs to watch that fucking movie. It is so good. Oh, DC, how far you have fallen. And I would take this idea one step further. I would say that this idea of superheroes killing goes against everything that I've talked about so far, because for both Batman and Superman, and probably a lot of heroes, the core of their themes and ideology is their belief in equality. Batman and Superman both acknowledge that they are no better than anyone else, and that any benefits that they have had in their lives come from chance, that anyone could be in their position easily. But when killing someone, you are raising yourself over them, creating a hierarchy, and saying, I, who am in a position and right to do so, judge you as being beyond redemption and beyond doing anything good in this world. So I deem that you need to die for everyone else's benefit. And for heroes who are fundamentally saying you can all be Batman and Superman, you just have to stand up and do the hard work, that does kind of run counter to what they represent. Now, I'm not saying that heroes can't kill. I'm not saying that it's a universal rule. Sometimes killing people is the only way to stop things, and hey, if someone other than Batman wants to kill Joker, go for it. I actually have a very, very poetic death planned for Joker. The problem, however, is that it has to be compatible with the themes those heroes embody, and I don't think that they are with what Superman and Batman are about. Can you tell I really love Batman and Superman? Oh, and here's a roadmap to how you actually do Batman v Superman in a way that's actually, good and doesn't end with save Martha. I know I've talked about them enough already, but I don't want to have to make a separate video on the topic, so nah. One of the faults of Superman is that he is kind of a big Boy Scout. He believes in law and order, and he is very much a lawful good in a world where the law sometimes isn't good at all. So back when Batman and Superman are still largely going solo and haven't met yet, the big wigs of Gotham are having trouble with Batman, and so they call in Superman saying, oh, this villain in a bat costume is terrorizing the city, please someone help us. So Superman flies in and, confronts Batman asking, why are you doing this? Asking him to stop, and Batman, being the chaotic good and the loner that he is, doesn't feel like explaining himself and tries to go around Superman, but Superman, of course, with all his power, doesn't let him. Those who Batman was after get away, and so Batman leaves, telling Clark that he does good work and that that he's doing the same thing. Superman, of course, sees Batman clearly breaking all sorts of laws, and he can't see how he and Batman are on the same side. You have this happen one or two more times, maybe even having them getting into a bit of a fight where, Batman tries to just push aside Superman, but nothing super big, because remember, conflict born out of people not communicating is, more often than not, bullshit. And because Batman would have obviously known about Superman and doesn't want to hurt Superman if he can avoid it. Until finally, the two of them kind of just come to an impasse, and they both finally explain themselves to each other, and Batman explains how those who call up Superman are the evil ones, making Superman finally step aside and letting Batman at those he's been chasing before the two of them part. Superman learns that breaking the law doesn't always mean a person is a criminal, and Batman learns to let people in a little bit and to talk to people instead of trying to just go around them and do everything himself. And this also sets up the contact which will later be used to grow the Justice League. Oh, and can I just add that even though the New 52 was a little bit of a shit show overall, one of the things that it did so well was the introduction of the Court of Owls into Batman's story. Seriously, it is so genius. Batman is trying to save Gotham City, but the Court of Owls is basically Gotham's history and ingrained elitism and corruption coming to try and kill him. The Court of Owls is Gotham City telling Batman, we don't want to change. We like things the way they are. Alright everyone, we're in the home stretch here. I'm just going to go more quickly through the last few members of the Justice League that I have ideas for. These aren't going to be as complete as Batman's or Superman's analyses because I haven't been involved with them as much as the former two, but still love them all the same, so here they are. I guess let's go with Wonder Woman because she kind of rounds out the big three in the Justice League. Like, no matter what movie or comic it is, the Justice League always has at least Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman. But honestly, for the longest time, I struggled to figure out what Wonder Woman represented, and considering how I think her portrayal is one of the most inconsistent amongst the major DC heroes, I'm inclined to think that many writers aren't sure either. Though that also could be straight cis men still having no idea how to write women. But I had an epiphany when I watched Justice League War. Again, overall, not my favorite DC movie. It was done in that phase DC went through where they made Superman really super angry all the time and turned him into a prick, and the whole thing kind of signaled the beginning of the end for the DC animated movies that I loved so much previously. But if there's one thing that the movie does very well, it's how it does Wonder Woman. She's loud, she's over the top, she's gung-ho, she just throws herself straight into the middle of a fight. She's totally confident in herself and totally unashamed of who she is. She really is the highlight of the movie for me. But the best scene is near the beginning, where there are these protesters who are angry about how inappropriate her costume is, I think. And she just lassos the head protester and says, okay, now tell me what you really think. And he admits, I cross-dress in a Wonder Woman costume. It makes me feel powerful. And of course, all the protesters just go, but Diana, she just laughs and says, embrace your truth, my friend. My outfit makes me feel powerful too. And in that moment, I realized that that's exactly who Wonder Woman needs to be. Well, maybe not the clothes part, because she's Wonder Woman. She should feel powerful no matter what she's wearing. But that line, embrace your truth, should be her fucking catchphrase. I realized that Diana's theme is truth because she was created as a feminist hero, and as much as edgelord fuckboys say, feminism is this soy-infused conspiracy to feminize society and open it up to mass immigration and cuckoldry or something, feminism is really about trying to make it so that people are free to live their truths. Feminism, and especially intersectional feminism, which we should of course all aspire to, is about fighting against societal expectations, stereotypes, and biases which seek to put people into boxes and to limit human freedom and expression based on a certain quality, with feminism focusing on gender, while intersectional feminism acknowledges that other prejudices like racism, ableism, etc. compound on top of it, and that these biases and prejudices ultimately hurt everyone, especially misogyny, because not only does it degrade femininity and all of the roles and attributes which it forces onto women, but because of that, it forces men into behavior which can be very toxic and harmful to themselves and everyone around them, hence toxic masculinity. These stereotypes and societal gender roles force people into conformity and into abandoning their truth, forcing people to hide who they are so as to avoid shaming, isolation, and even violence. But feminism works to break down those rules and those stereotypes, not necessarily to make them cease to exist, but to make them optional. If you want to conform to those archetypes, then you can, but you don't have to, and you won't face prejudice and consequences if you choose not to. Embrace your truth, my friend. And really, it makes sense for Wonder Wonder Woman, considering she's from a culture where there really basically are no gender roles, because it is a society of all women, so women need to fulfill all roles, both quote-unquote masculine and quote-unquote feminine ones. But I think she also goes beyond, the second wave traditional, some would say white feminism, but into intersectionality, because we've seen, in recent depictions with black Amazons and a multiracial Themyscira, which again makes sense because in ancient Rome, they didn't care about skin color. And, because Amazonian society would obviously be very accepting of same-sex relationships, not just because it's based off of ancient Greek society, and seriously, the ancient Greeks were really fucking gay, but also because it is a society of all women, for fuck's sakes, people. How is it only recently that we finally acknowledge that, hey, maybe the woman raised amongst all women would maybe be into women as well as men too? Diana would kind of come into the outside world and see so many biases and prejudices in the society that are so alien to her, and so she seeks to fight against these prejudices and show people that there are better ways, while also maybe helping to change Amazonian society too, because I could maybe see Themyscira not being all that accepting of trans people, and that's something that Diana takes back to them and says, hey, this isn't okay. We're so much further along in so many ways than the outside world, but yet we still have this problem. Like, that's not okay. And I mean, like, she literally has the lasso of truth, something which can force people to speak their truth even when they themselves don't want to acknowledge it. And like, for the longest time, I thought that this seemed a little odd, that this was something she had. Like, that was her main weapon. Like, really? That's it? But like, now it makes perfect sense. And, of course, what better antagonist to a woman seeking to liberate the oppressed of the world so that they can live their truths than the literal embodiment of toxic masculinity, male violence, and dick wagging, the god of war Ares. Don't really think I need to go into that all that much, do I? I think that's pretty self-evident. Another character I really find who is often really inconsistent in their portrayal is Aquaman. And the hashtag comic skaters really seem to love to laugh at him, which I don't see why, because when you really think about it, he actually seems pretty cool. And again, I had wondered about what Aquaman represented, but it came to me after thinking over his story a little bit. You see, Aquaman is Atlantean, but he has a human father and an Atlantean mother, and was raised on land in the surface world by his father within one very particular culture before he was forced into a completely different one, and had to learn how to navigate it. Now, if that doesn't sound like a biracial narrative, I don't know what does. Even though I know that the whole of two worlds but accepted by neither is kind of an offensive cliche, so personally I would definitely make sure to avoid going that far into it. But that's one of the reasons why I think casting Jason Momoa, a man of color, in the role of Aquaman is something that I actually really like about the DC movies. It would have been way better though if they had incorporated more Hawaiian aesthetic and imagery into the Atlanteans. Now, I love Aquaman being a person of color because frankly, it's also nice to have some variety in the Justice League, considering that we have, like, what, 5 white guys with blonde hair already? But I don't think that Aquaman's story is just about being biracial. I also think it has more to do with being the king of Poseidonus and the Atlanteans, because he has ties to both worlds, and he really kind of has to try to negotiate and mediate between the two. The Atlanteans believe that the seas belong to them, that the humans don't respect it and pollute it, and they want it all for themselves, while the surface world needs the ocean to survive, and they kind of have just as much a claim to the ocean as the Atlanteans do. So how are you supposed to find a happy medium between the two? This is something which plays out in our real world right now. How do you find agreement between two groups of people who have such fundamentally different cultures and such fundamentally different priorities which often conflict with one another? How do you find compromise between two sides which almost seem convinced that there is no other route to take other than to go to war? These are ideas that I would absolutely love to see explored in comics, and I think that Aquaman is the absolute perfect hero to explore those themes and situations. These are also themes which Aquaman's not one but two nemesises play into as well. Nemesisi, whatever. You have Ocean Master, who is really an ultranationalist, someone who will never compromise, who is totally unwilling to see from the perspective of the other because he believes that his side is just inherently superior, and who believes that the only option to keep their culture intact is to insert their inherent superiority and destroy their enemy. And then you have Black Manta, who is basically a war profiteer, someone who, in the end, doesn't care who wins, but doesn't want peace because peace means that there's no money to be made and no power to be gained, which is why he often works alongside Ocean Master when it's convenient for him, but would happily stab him in the back in a minute if he could get his hands on what he wanted. And I think that Green Lantern's story also kind of has a similar kind of exploratory nature, but explores a different problem in society. One that also, though, is just as important. And it was from another of the DC animated movies that I figured this one out too. In Justice League Crisis on Two Earths, Green Lantern says, "For all my power, I'm just a beat cop." And I think that that's very true. For all of its space opera grand scale, the Green Lanterns are essentially cops. Green Lantern's story is essentially a cop drama. And a story like that, I think, really does good to explore what it really means to be a cop, what it means to enforce the law, what sort of problems do you have to overcome, and what sort of pitfalls do you risk falling into. I know a lot of people will call me a bad leftist for talking about this sort of stuff, but I would say that Hal Jordan is an example of a good cop, someone who genuinely wants to help people, to protect them, and to stand up for the little guy, so they don't need to worry about being pushed around by the bullies. While you have Sinestro, who is the bad cop, the cop who wields violence and intimidation to oppress others, to reinforce his own power and superiority over others, and who sees himself as above the law which he enforces. And then on top of that, you have the Guardians of Oa, who are like the higher-ups within the police force, who only care about the big picture, only care that crime rates are going down, that they're not going over budget, who don't get their hands dirty, and who have lost touch with the ordinary people who have to live with the ramifications of their decisions. Now, keeping with the alien space drama, you have Martian Manhunter, who is someone who I think needs to be used more. He was big like 10 years ago and like appeared all over the place, but he just hasn't been seen until like Supergirl in like 2017, really. Which is a shame because I think he's a really interesting character, and in an era where we're now seeing the worst refugee crisis in history, the story of a person who literally watched as his world died in front of him and lost everything he had ever known and loved, now having to try and rebuild his life in a different place with a very different culture and different history, is more relevant now than it has ever been. Plus, I think that it also helps that more often than not, he's portrayed as taking on the persona of a black man when pretending to be human, and speaks in a somewhat different accent from everyone else. That really helps carry through the immigrant/refugee theme. I know I sort of brought this up in my Superman take, but I think that Martian Manhunter kind of has the potential to really kind of push it forward and really make it the center of its narrative. Even having villains take from it too, with his brother Malva Oct, having maybe been radicalized by the destruction of their home and wanting to continue the war on their new home, unwilling to let go of the past, or maybe even having those who were the Martians' enemies show up on Earth and have John have to deal with them, either fight those who want to continue to battle, who want to continue and try to kill him, or come to forgive them if they just want to find a new home. Now, the last Justice League member I have any idea for is Cyborg, and it's a little bit basic. I just think that it's interesting that Cyborg was in this terrible accident that resulted in him having to become a cyborg to save his life, and now kind of having to learn to live in the aftermath of that and get used to the restrictions that come as a result of it, but also learn how to make the most of it and to discover the new things he is now capable of doing, which I think would be an interesting exploration of disability, PTSD, and living with prosthetics. And that's basically all I've got on DC Heroes. Sorry, Flash fans, I don't have anything for him. I'm not super familiar with him outside of a few things. I don't watch The Flash or anything, and so I don't really know what sort of themes he may explore outside of me just spitballing, like the idea of time and, being the fastest man in the world, but still never really quite arriving on time, but like you can't build a story out of that. And, and that's about it. I'm most familiar with him being the comic relief, which, I always liked and appreciated, but, that's really all I know of him. And I've got nothing for Hawkman. I mean, who still talks about Hawkman anymore? Which is kind of a shame. He's kind of cool, but still, like, who talks about Hawkman anymore? So yeah, hopefully you guys see where I'm coming from. Hopefully you guys agree with me that this is the direction that the DC heroes need to go in to really have impact again and to really resonate with modern audiences that aren't fascist and misogynist. I would love to one day get the opportunity to write for DC Comics and basically reboot their entire continuity to implement what I've laid out here. And like, I would frame it all through the reintroduction, the reworking, the rebooting of one of my absolute favorite characters from DC, who has been one of my favorite characters ever since I saw them all the way back when they were in the original Teen Titans TV show, back when it was still on the air. Who are they? Well, I can give you 3 words to describe them. Azarath, Metreon, Zinthos. Well, what do you all think of the DC heroes? How in love are you with what I've laid out here? How hard do you think we need to work to get DC to make me their new head writer? Please make sure to like, review, and subscribe to my podcast everywhere you find it. Every like, every comment, and every new follower really does make my day. Follow me on Twitter. Follow the show's Twitter. Share all of the episodes everywhere you can think of to help grow my community. And if you are so inclined and in such means, please consider throwing $1 or $2 into the beaten-up guitar case that I've laid onto the sidewalk that we in our enlightened times call Patreon. Seriously, every single dollar helps me out in so many ways, including but not exclusive to the fact that the unemployment rate for adults with autism in Ontario, where I live, is 80%. So this channel is really the only way I can make a living right now until my books get picked up by an agent. No pressure or anything though, only if you can afford it. So yeah, next video will be up in around 2 weeks time. It's going to be a bit of a retrospective, me kind of looking back on things as this year comes to an end, where I and the world should go in the future. Hopefully you guys are looking forward to it. So, until next time, may the privilege be with you. Stay entitled, snowflakes.